Alright, hey guys, welcome to another tutorial. Today we're going to do player sprinting and endurance. Basically, the player has the ability to sprint, and as long as you don't hold down the sprint button, or the shift button, I should say, for longer than about 10 seconds, you'll be able to sprint, staggeredly as long as you want, but if you end up holding it down for more than 10 seconds, you have to recover, you have to regain your stamina, and you won't be able to sprint until you gain it all back. So I'll give you a quick demonstration. So right now this is our walking speed. I reduced it. We'll do that in Kismet. But when you hold down the left shift key, this is when you start sprinting. And you can see those variables changing. Once that counter gets down to 0, you will not be able to sprint again until it gets back up to 10. And there we go. Now, no matter how much you hold down the shift key, you ain't gonna run until it gets up to 10. Now that we're back at 10, we'll be able to sprint again. And you can sprint, unsprint, anytime you want. So that's how that works. There's not much to do in terms of just overall level setup. As long as you just go to view, go properties, change that game type to UT game. That's all you really need to do. I just put these towers here just to give us a little bit of an environment. And it allows you to tell if you're moving faster or not just because it's so symmetrical and everything's lined up in such a way. So that's why the scene's set up the way it is. But past that, there's no, basic, meshing or any level building to be done to demonstrate this at all. There's no volumes, no nothing like that. So let me give you a quick demonstration of what this whole sequence looks like. This is just our debug. It gives us our variables, see what we're doing. And then when the player spawns, we put in the console command behind view. That's why we have a third-person camera. And then we modify the ground speed property. We make it 250 instead of, I believe it's 420. We make it 250 just so the player moves slowly at the beginning. From there, we have our key button pressed. That's the left shift button. We have the booleans. We check if it's being pressed or not. And then we check the endurance. Things get a little kind of hectic in this section. A lot of things need to be plugged into one another. And we need to check what each one's doing. And then down here is the main logic. This is where we go ahead and get the property. We modify the property. And then we start counting down the integers and everything. And just based on those numbers, that's when we'll be able to sprint again. And then, of course, we have our variables up here. So let's go ahead and just nuke everything out of there. So the first thing we're going to do is just do our initial setup of variables. So let's do a new variable. Let's do an object variable and just an object. And actually, no, what we need to do instead of an empty variable, it's actually going to be a player variable. So let's hold down the P key, do all players, uncheck all players, just make it player 0. And then let's just name this variable player. It's simple enough, it's just to keep track of the player. And then the next one we're going to do, it's going to be a float. So let's do a new variable, float, and just a float. It's going to be staying at 0. We're going to name this player speed, just to keep track of the speed of the player. And the next one is going to be an integer. So new variable, integer, integer. So this one's going to be actually a number of 10. This is basically our player's endurance, so let's name it that way. Player endurance. So it's about 10 seconds. That's how long the player can hold down that shift button before they have to, unhold it to regain it back. You can change this to whatever number you want. It doesn't really matter. It's just for testing purposes. I made it 10. But the last variable we're going to need, it's going to be a boolean. It's going to be set to false, not false, but false. And then we're going to name it B is player sprinting. This lets us know if the player is sprinting or not. So that's all the variables we're going to need. So let's marquee select this by holding down Control and Alt and left click dragging. With all of them selected, let's hit the C key to comment, and we're just going to name these variables. So that's the first step. The next thing we're going to do is just our debug logging. So let's do new event, level loaded. We want to keep track of everything once the level is loaded. And then if you hold down the L key and left click, you'll get a log. Our target's going to be the player, so let's go ahead and just get our name variable for that. New variable, name variable, it would be player, and then the name player. Put that into target. And we're going to have to go ahead and expose a few different variable outputs. First one's float. That's going to be for the player speed. So let's copy and paste this name variable, change its expected type to float, change the name to player speed, and then plug it in. The next one we're going to expose is a boolean. So let's go down to bool, copy and paste the named variable here, Change its type to bool, and let's name it B is player sprinting. Plug that in. Last one is going to be our integer, expose variable, integer. Let's go ahead and copy and paste that. Change its type to int, and then name this player endurance. And there we go, plug it in. Let's just organize this a tad bit. And then plug that in to load it invisible. And we're also going to loop this every second or so. And loop it back. And that's all you need for the debug. So I'll name that debug. Now let's get to the nitty-gritty. Let's start getting this going. So the first event we're going to need is every time the player spawned. So new action, not new action, new event, player spawned. And we want this, the only variable, not variable, but the only thing we need to change inside of its properties is just max trigger count. We want that to go to 0, just so we can call this as many times as we can. For the instigator, let's just copy and paste our player named variable. And then for spawn point, let's just grab our spawn point in the level. Right click, add that. So now we have our player start for the player spawn node. And the first thing we're going to do is the console command that gives us the third person view, just for, you know, I guess visuals, just aesthetic really, just like being in third person. But let's go to new action, misc console command, plug that in. Target is going to be the player, so let's hook that up. Then in the actual console command itself, the only command we're going to have is behind view. And then last but not least, we're going to go to new action, object property, modify property, plug that in. The property we're going to be messing with this entire time is the pawn variable in the actual unscript .uc files. It's the variable called ground speed, and that is one word. So property name ground speed. Check modify property. And by default, like I said, I believe it's 420 for your normal walking speed. So we're going to reduce that to 250 just so that we're slower than usual. And last but not least, let's just go ahead and put the player as our target. And that's all we need at the original setup. So grab all these guys, kind of move into place, hit C to comment. We're just going to name this player initialization. We grab that. Let's just organize this a bit. Now let's go ahead and play and see if we have our third-person view and our slower speed. So we have our third-person view and our slower speed. So that's good. But when we hold down Shift, you know, nothing happens. But we got everything going working so far. So that's always a good. It's always good to check up every step of the way to make sure everything's still working. But the next thing we're going to do is the actual key button input from the player to actually sprint, which is going to be the left shift button on your keyboard. So I'll show you how to do that. Let's right click, new event, input key button pressed. So under input names, let's hit that plus sign. And the name itself is left shift, all one word, and the L and the S are capitalized. And the last thing we need to do, actually no, that's the only variable we need to change, I believe. Actually no, the RE trigger delay, so this is the delay. In order to get to the release, because we're going to have to mess with the released output, in order for that to activate properly, the trigger delay needs to be absolutely 0, not 0.01, not 0.00001, just 0. I'm not too sure why, but I had to do a little research on that, and that's what I found out. And it does work that way, which is strange, but it's what it does. So the first thing we want to do whenever the shift button is pressed and released is set our variable is player sprinting, that boolean. So let's go to set variable, bool, going to pressed. Let's go grab that variable from up here, B is player sprinting. And then the value for this one is going to be true, so let's make that a 1. Then we're just going to copy and paste this. And then under released, we're going to plug that in, but change that to false, which is the 0. So let's see if that's working. We're going to keep an eye out for that debug on the bottom there. Right now it's false, and it says true. Now it's false. Now it's true, false. So we know that's working. That's always a good sign. But there's a second part to this that we need to do for this end here. These guys have to call a certain function. It's the check endurance event that we're going to create next, but let's go ahead and make the remote events for them. So let's go to new action, event, activate remote event, and we're just going to call this check endurance. Right now they're just going to have the X on them because we haven't created the event, but both of these are going to call that check endurance. So that's all set up. So let's go ahead and make that check endurance event. So let's go to new event, remote event, check endurance, update these. So the first thing we need to do when we check endurance is we're going to check the value of the player endurance. By default it's at 10, but we're going to have that changed eventually when we do that main logic. But for right now we're just checking where the endurance is at. So with that we need a new condition, a comparison, and it's an int, so we need to do the integer. So plug that in. Let's go grab that integer named variable. That's going to be A. And what we're going to check, we're going to see if we're going to compare it with the number 0. So basically, is the player endurance 0? If it is, we're going to do a couple things. So that's going to be our second number for B. So let's create a new int variable and just leave it at 0. And the first thing we're going to do is if A is greater than B, so basically if the player endurance is not 0, we're going to go ahead and delay that about 0.1 seconds. We're going to plug it back into the comparison because we want to keep comparing it. We want to just keep comparing it until it's either less than or equal to 0 or greater than or equal to 0. So if it's greater than or equal to 0, we're going to go ahead and compare the int again. We do any delays. So once again, A greater than or equal to B. We want to plug into the new compare int. Bring the player endurance back over. And then the B one is actually going to be 10. We're going to see if it's anywhere near 10. And what we need to do now, with the A is less than B, we're going to set that as an activate delay at 0.1. And we're going to send this back to the very first comparison, just because it has to keep looping. We've got to keep checking. That's why there's a bunch of these loops. But what else we need to do, if A is greater than or equal to B, meaning it's either 10 or greater than 10, this is when we want to go ahead and turn on the, actually before we even turn it on, we're going to turn it off. So what we're going to do, if A is ever less than or equal to B, so if in this first comparison, if player endurance is 0 or less, this is where we're going to go ahead and turn off the ability to even use that shift. So let's go to new action, toggle, plug that in. Actually, instead of turn on, it's going to be on the turn off. And then the event is going to be our key button pressed event. And then after it's done, we're going to send activate delay at about 0.1. We're just going to send it back here because we got to keep looping. But what else we're going to do with this A is less than or equal to B, we're going to turn off. So when this happens, we want to set that variable, that boolean, is player sprinting to false because they can't sprint anymore because they've run out of endurance essentially. So let's go ahead and copy and paste this one. And then plug it in there as well, just so there are 2 in here. And then what we're going to do down here with the second comparison is if at any time the player endurance is greater than or equal to 10, we want to go ahead and turn that back on, that event that we toggled off. So we're going to turn that back on. So that shift button, we're going to be able to press it again. And then this delay, it goes back into this compare int. So everything's looping back to one another. So it looks kind of messy, but overall, it kind of makes sense. Every time we check the endurance, we're first seeing if the player endurance is less than 0. If it's ever less than 0, we're going to turn off the player's ability to use the shift button. And then we're going to keep comparing it from there. But if for any reason the player endurance is greater than or equal to 0, we're going to go ahead and see if it's greater than or equal to 10. If it is greater than or equal to 10, at this point we're going to turn that trigger volume, we're going to turn back on the ability to use that left shift button and to sprint and everything like that. So that's all the comparisons. So right now we can't test to see if this is working or not, but let's go ahead and just key select all this. And we're just going to name this player input. and endurance check. Whoops. Let's try that again. Player input and endurance check. There you go. Let's go ahead and move that into position just to make everything super organized. So now we're going to go into the meat of everything. This is where we're going to actually, change the properties of everything, and from there, we're going to do what we need to do. So basically, everything's going to stem from when the levels are loaded. So let's go to New Event, Level Loaded. And as soon as the level's loaded, we want to go ahead and compare to see if the player is sprinting. So let's go to New Condition, Comparison, Compare Bool, plug that in. Let's go ahead and get the B is player sprinting Boolean named variable in here. So now what we want to do is, if it's true that the player is sprinting, we're going to get a property. So new action, object, property, get property. The target is going to be the player, so let's go ahead and grab the player name variable. And then the property we're going to get, if you select the get property, it's going to be our ground speed, that same variable that we're going to be messing with. And ground speed is measured as a decimal, so that means it's a float. So we're going to go ahead and grab our player speed name variable, that float, and we're going to plug it into the float output right here. And that's all we need to do with that. So let's move these a little. Now, that's good to be that distance away, but what we need to do now is modify that property, that ground speed property. So let's go to New Action, Object Property, Modify Property, plug that in, put the player in as the target, and then in Modify Property, add one, drop down that list. Property name is ground speed, and check, yeah, we want to modify the property, and we're going to turn it to 600. So that's our sprinting speed. And then what we need to do now is a bunch of math, which is going to be awesome and fun. So what we're going to do, we're going to subtract ints here. So new action, math, subtract int, plug that in. And the int we're going to be subtracting from is the player's endurance, because whenever the player is sprinting, we want the endurance to go down. So we're going to subtract by 1 at this point. So go ahead and copy that player endurance. Put that into AN, the int result, because we want the player endurance to, no. So basically, if you have player endurance and we subtract 1, we want the new int result to be the player endurance. So basically, if player endurance is 10 and we subtract it by 1, the int result is going to be player endurance, but it's going to be 9 this time, and then 8, and then 7, and everything like that. So just what we need to do now is just get our b in there. So let's create a new variable, and b is going to be 1 because we're going to subtract it by 1. This could be anything you want, just depending on how you want everything set up. But what we need to do at this point is compare ints now. So let's go to new condition, comparison, compare int, plug that in. And the reason why now we're comparing ints is we want to see if player endurance ever gets equal to 0 or below 0 and everything like that. So player endurance is going to be our A, and then our B is going to be another int variable at 0. So what we want to do at this point, if A is ever equal to or less than 0, we want to go ahead and make player endurance equal to 0, just so it doesn't drop down below 0, because it will go to like -1, -2, -3, so on like that. So let's go to new action, set variable, int A is less than or equal to B. Our target is player endurance. Our value is 0. So that's set up. And then what we want to do, if for any reason player endurance is greater than or equal to 0, we're going to set an activate delay of about 1 second. And we're just going to shoot this all the way back to the very beginning, to the original comparison, because we want to start the whole check over again. And then what else we're going to do here, at the very end here, we're going to set an activate delay of about 0.01. And we're also going to set this all the way back to the beginning, just so everything loops together. Whoops. Make sure it actually plugs in. Now we got that set up, but now we got to worry about when the player is sprinting Boolean. When it's false, we want to go ahead and set them, and we want to modify the properties again, and we want to start adding back those endurance points. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to grab this modify property, just because we already created it. The target's still going to be a player, so let's just plug false into that. But the modify property, instead of it being 600, it's going to go back to 250. That's our walking speed. Everything else is going to be the same. It's still going to be ground speed, and we're going to still have that modify property checked. But now, instead of subtracting ints, we're going to go ahead and add ints back together. So let's go to new action, math, add int, plug that in. So A is going to be player endurance, and so is int result. And then B is also going to be 1, because we're adding 1 back. Now what we need to do is compare ints again. So let's just get that by going to new condition, comparison, compare int. And so A is going to be our player endurance variable, and then B is actually going to be the number 10. That's our max endurance, like we had said before. What we want to have happen here, if A for any reason is less than B, we want to go ahead and set an activate delay of about 0.01 seconds. We're actually going to change this one from 1 second to actually we're going to keep that to 1 second, and we're actually going to keep this to 1 second as well, because it's going to take 1 second to add each one back and subtract 1. That's why that 1 second's there. But we'll bring this all the way back to the very initial comparison. But if for any reason A, so player endurance, is ever equal to or greater than 10, that's when we'll go ahead and do the same thing we kind of did over here. We're going to go ahead and create a new action, set variable, int, plug that in. So if for any reason A, which is player endurance, ever becomes greater than or equal to 10, we're just going to set that variable to 10. So target is player endurance, value is 10. And then we're going to do a 0.01 activate delay on this and loop it back to the very beginning. And there we go. So that's all the logic we need. So let me go ahead and comment this. Logic to adjust player speed and endurance. And now the fun part, we get to test, see if we did everything right. So let's go ahead and play. So we're sprinting, and we see the numbers counting down. Now we stop sprinting. We're sprinting again. And now let's hold it down until it gets all the way to 0. And now we can't sprint again, so we know it's working. So that is perfect. We did everything right. But let's see if we can recover once we're back at 10. And we can. Alright, awesome. So we got everything good and ready to go, which always is a good thing to see. So let's just recap everything. You know, at the very top, we just have our debug log. Lets us know the values of our player speed, the value of our Boolean, if the player is sprinting or not, and then the player endurance, what number we're at. But the first real thing we did is we created our variables. We have our player variable, we have our player speed variable, we have our player endurance variable, and then we have that Boolean variable to see if we're sprinting. But once we actually spawn the player, we print in that console command behind view, just to get us a third-person camera. There's nothing much more to that. But then we set the initial ground speed for our character, because by default, Unreal defaults to the 420 value for your ground speed. So we're going to make that 250 just to make us a little bit slower, just so the sprinting stands out more. You can mess with that value however you like, see which one works best for you, and go from there. But the next thing is the actual input. We have our key button pressed. Our button is left shift, just so you know the left shift button on your keyboard causes you to sprint if you can. And the only thing we change besides that is the reactivation of the trigger delay. So how long it delays between activation, we made that 0, just so the released function is used properly. If you don't have it set to 0, it's not going to actually, it's not going to have a call to this. It's not going to work. But with the key button pressed event, Whenever we press or release the shift button, we go ahead and adjust the B is player sprinting variable accordingly. And then both these end up calling the check endurance. So check endurance, what happens is we compare the player endurance at the time to 0 to see if it's greater than or equal to 0 or less than to equal to 0. And if the player endurance is ever less than or equal to 0, we turn off the ability to hold down the left shift button. That doesn't work anymore. And then we also go ahead and set that variable B is player sprinting to false, because he's not able to sprint. He won't be able to until the endurance sets all the way back up. But then we also have a bunch of callbacks to the comparison, because we're always comparing. But if for any reason the player endurance is greater than or equal to 0, we then check to see if that player endurance is also greater than or equal to 10. If it's greater than or equal to 10, we go ahead and turn the ability of sprinting back on. And then if it's less than 10, we make a call back to the very beginning. And then we have these delays that can, check every 0.1 second. It keeps on checking no matter what. But then past that, as soon as the level loads, we go ahead and compare if the player is sprinting or not. If they are sprinting, we get the player speed property, the ground speed, and we put that property into our player speed here. And then we go ahead and modify that to 600. So originally it was 250, but now we set it up to 600, so they're sprinting. And as long as they're sprinting, we're subtracting 1 from player endurance. And if for any reason player endurance ever becomes less than or equal to 0, we set that value, player endurance, back to 0, just so it doesn't get into the negatives. So you don't see -1s, you don't see -2, you don't see anything like that. And then we have a bunch of callbacks to the very beginning comparison, just to keep the loop going. But then when the player lets go of the shift button, meaning the player is sprinting is false, we change the modify property again, we bring it back to 250. And then we start adding the integers back to player endurance every second. And if for any reason the player endurance is greater than or equal to 10, we just set that variable to 10, just so you don't see numbers like 11, 12, 13, everything over 10. And then we just make calls back again to the comparison of the bool, just to keep the loop going. So that is everything for this player sprint. This was something I always wanted to work on. I just had to keep thinking about the logic behind it. But we were able to get it done, and relatively easy. It's kind of confusing with all those loops, so just keep, if you're confused, if you're running into any problems, keep looking at the sections where I'm plugging them into, because there is a couple of parts where you need to keep calling it back and forth. But if you like the video, definitely like the video. It does help. Share the video as well with other people who may need this knowledge. And also, if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and subscribe. It definitely helps a lot, and we'll keep growing together. We're almost at, I think, 400 subscribers, which is pretty dope. It's a lot, I think. But, we can keep it on growing. We can keep on growing. So, once again, I'm glad you guys keep watching. If you have any suggestions, also comment with those below. And keep looking for these videos. I'm going to keep on working on these. So, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.